Hello and welcome to the Justin Center podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. And just a quick reminder that Justin Center as an organization is supported by donors. So we would ask that you would help us contribute to the work that we do to continue so that we can continue doing all the things that we do, including our podcast and the courses with the Widener Institute, as well as our publishing house. If you don't know much about us or all the things that we do, you can go to justincenter.org and find out more information there. You can go to our donate page and figure out how you can support us either financially or by way of bringing information about us to those who may be interested in supporting us, or just telling others that we exist and about the resources that we offer. And of course, we always desire your prayers. Now, today on the program, I'm going to be playing an interview that I just did with a friend of mine, Samuel Parkison, who has a pretty new book called To Gaze Upon God, the Beatific Vision in Doctrine, Tradition, and Practice. This is a really wonderful text on the doctrine of the Beatific Vision, something that is really central to a lot of Christian theology and piety, but something that doesn't often get its own unique treatment. Sam Parkison, he has his PhD from Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He is Associate Professor of Theological Studies at the Gulf Theological Seminary in the United Arab Emirates. I hope I'm saying that right. And he's written a number of other books as well. He has one on beauty, irresistible beauty, that was a really good text as well that I really enjoyed it, among a number of other things, and he's published all sorts of articles here. So I'm going to be trying to do a few of these interviews with some other authors, people from outside of the Lutheran tradition that have been engaged in some of these conversations about the doctrine of God in recent years. So hopefully I have some more of these coming out soon as well, and I hope you enjoy. So Dr. Parkison, thank you so much for joining me on the program today. And I'm so excited to have you and to be able to discuss this really important topic in this book that you have just written.
Yeah.
So let's just kind of start off, maybe before we even get to the book, tell us a little bit, because my listeners are largely Lutheran, but not all Lutheran. In fact, it's probably about half of my listeners that are Lutheran, maybe even if that. But, the Lutheran listeners, I know when I have in the past cited certain maybe Baptists on various topics related to the doctrine of God, I always get these comments of like, why are you listening to Baptists? Or why are Baptists even talking about this stuff? Do Baptists even care about historical theology? And so maybe just we can start there to say you are a Baptist and just explain kind of what got you interested, within that theological tradition in particular, in exploring some of this more kind of classical philosophy and classical theology.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I can attest that you have more than Lutheran watchers. I myself am a long time listener and first time caller, as it were. And so, but yeah, I think my journey into more of a classical historical retrieval theology probably came in a similar way that just about anybody else does. For some people, what that ends up looking like is them moving into a different tradition, whereas for me, it hasn't materialized in that way, and I don't actually see. So the kind of association, the verbal association that you're sort of drawing there in terms of Baptist equals non-historical or not self-consciously rooted in the tradition. I think that's a fair verbal association, but it is an accidental association, not a essential one. So my self-understanding of my own Baptist roots is not, I would not identify with the Anabaptists, the radical reformers, for example. I'm more of a Second London Baptist Confession of Faith kind of Baptist. So tracing my own theological heritage back through the Puritans and the Reformed Baptists there in England in the 17th century, and they're just the nonconformist church in the 16th and 17th century, which is an outgrowth of the Reformation. So my own theological roots are squarely in the Reformation, and then from the Reformation we can keep going further back. I identify within the Western medieval tradition as well, and then the early church as well. So I look at um, the characteristic description of many Baptists being very light on historical lineage as a tragedy, and one that's not essential to a Baptist identity. I don't think that it's something that is essentially baked in, that in order to have Baptist convictions on, for example, local church polity or credo baptism, that uh, that part of the package deal requires for you to sort of cut yourself off from the Church Catholic. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but my own more of an autobiographical journey was just after in 2016 there was a explosion on the evangelical landscape on the doctrine of the Trinity, and there was a novel position that had basically run rampant for the previous couple of decades called eternal functional subordinationism. And there were several people who began to sort of call attention to it in the evangelical world, and are sort of adjacent to the evangelical world. So there's, Orthodox Presbyterian brothers who would be quick to say we're not evangelical, but they're still kind of like in that world, and speaking into it. So, so they're kind of calling attention to that. And that was a unnerving experience for me, because that was all I knew was evangelical theology of the EFS variety. I was reading Wayne Grudem's systematic theology and benefiting from Bruce Ware's theology and that kind of thing. So for when that happened, it really forced me to kind of search for answers. And then as I began to dig deeper into the tradition, and particularly the fourth century church fathers, I realized, most of these questions were already sorted out in the fourth century. And if we just keep the framework that they had, we wouldn't have to try to reinvent the wheel every generation and risk kind of moving into heterodox at best Trinitarian theology. So from Trinitarian theology, it's just kind of branched out into all other areas of theology for me.
Yeah, that's great. And I think the story that you have there is pretty similar to my own story, and I think a lot of people as well. Is when I had first really began to study the doctrine of God. This was during those open theism debates had been happening at that time, and were continuing to happen to some degree. And Bruce Ware was, for a lot of people, the kind of go-to theologian who had responded to the open theist movement. And so I had read a number of his articles on that particular issue, and I don't think I was aware enough of classical Trinitarian theology to kind of recognize those areas of pretty significant divergence. And it was really only later, after spending some time with classical Trinitarian sources, going back and reading him again, that I start to realize that this is not exactly what the fathers were saying. This is not exactly the kind of inherited Western approach to Trinitarian orthodoxy. And I have to say that, giving some credit to Baptists here, is that James Dolezal is really the one who kind of woke me up from my dogmatic slumber, you may say. And I listened to that James Dolezal interview with Reformed Forum on. This was on Divine Simplicity, I think. This was a number of years ago. And I think my head just exploded listening to this thing. And this opened up this whole, for me at least, that's what opened me up to this kind of whole new world of classical theism, and caused me to really visit those sources more intensely.
No, that's great. Dolezal was significant for me as well in my discovery of the classical tradition. So wonderful.
So you've written a couple of books now dealing with some of these issues. I know that you've had a book on beauty that really does draw a lot on some of these kind of classical theistic conceptions that we're going to be talking about here in this book. And I really enjoyed that book. I recommend that one as well to explore, if you want to explore a very theological conception of beauty. But this book is dealing with what is a related topic of the Beatific Vision. And so what was it exactly that got you interested in this particular element of classical theism? You know, we think of this kind of explosion of books and articles on the subject of more broadly classical theism. These books tend to focus on things like divine simplicity, that tends to take kind of a center stage, or divine immutability, or you have a lot of things written on the EFS debate. But the Beatific Vision is something that is so essential to classical theology, but I don't think has received probably the same amount of attention as some of the other things. Maybe just because it's not as much of a clear point of debate. But what was it that got you interested in this particular subject?
Yeah, well, you alluded to my other book, Irresistible Beauty. That is actually my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, and that book in particular is focused on it's kind of trying to do some interdisciplinary things with biblical theology and systematic theology and a little bit of philosophical work as well, to establish a realist view of beauty, and then to root beauty in the transcendentals in the life of God. But then the sort of follow-up question to that is, okay, well, if beauty is a divine attribute in some way, what, if at all, does it have to do with what at all does the incarnation of Christ have to tell us about beauty? And if Christ is the apex of divine self-revelation of divine beauty, what is the role of Christ's beauty in conversion, and primarily the relationship between regeneration and saving faith? So I kind of carve out a typical Reformed view of the relationship between regeneration and saving faith. But towards the end of that book, in the last chapter of that book, I wanted to kind of draw out some of the implications of my thesis for other related theological loci, and that included sanctification, but also glorification and the Beatific Vision. So that kind of put me into the domain of considering the Beatific Vision. It's a topic that I had no previous introduction to. It was kind of my own research that pushed me into that direction. And so that's one of the reasons why I love theological retrieval, is because pulling on some of these threads does wind you up into different domains that you might not previously sort of be seeking out. But you end up finding there in those areas answers to questions that you're asking in some other area that you didn't anticipate. So that's exactly what happened. I kind of stumbled into the Beatific Vision and wrote some reflections there on the little bit of research that I was able to do sort of towards the conclusion of my book. But then there was an opportunity for me to submit a proposal for just a single monograph at IVP Academic, and there was a couple of ideas that I was batting around, but the Beatific Vision is the one that I really settled on. So it was kind of like the last chapter of my dissertation. All PhD dissertations always end up with, these are other areas of potential fruitful inquiry.
Yes. Yep.
And it was one of those few times where I said that, and then I followed up on my own advice and sort of took a future inquiry and then expanded it out to a book length. So that's really what this book is it's endeavoring to be a work of retrieval. So it's, in that way, it's something of a primer. I'm trying to introduce people who have never heard of the Beatific Vision before to it. And so I'm giving definitions and that sort of thing. And I'm also giving a historical survey of sort of how the doctrine was received through the ages, and how it was articulated and refined and received by various traditions. And then I conclude the book with trying to carve out some dogmatic articulations about the doctrine in relation to various other doctrines. And then finally, how the doctrine actually impacts and enriches the Christian life. And so, yeah, it's one of those things where it was a deeply rewarding, probably one of only a couple of books that I'll ever have this experience in my entire life, where it was so rewarding, so enriching, pure worship for me from beginning to end, I was researching and then writing this book. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. And this is a text that, I mean, you do, as you said, you use figures from all different theological traditions, and really there is a significant kind of overlap, coherence between theologians of various traditions on this issue. And so let's talk then a little bit about what exactly the Beatific Vision is, and then we can start to delve into maybe some of those theologians or ideas that you bring into view here. So just kind of quick summary. How do you define somebody who's never even heard of the doctrine? What is the Beatific Vision?
Yeah, the Beatific Vision, beatific simply means happy or blessed. And so the Beatific Vision is the blessed vision. And the blessed vision that we're talking about in the Beatific Vision is the hope of getting to see God in the eschaton. And so the hope of seeing God, it's something that you can trace throughout the biblical storyline. There's figures in Holy Scripture that want to see God, that request to see God in various ways. And it's always this sort of eschatological promise that's held out at the end of when we actually get to experience this. So this is the thing that Moses is asking for in Exodus 33 when he's on Mount Horeb, and he says, "Show me your glory." It's the thing that David pines after in Psalm 27:4 when he says, "One thing have I asked of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple." I always like pointing out that David is saying that, and David didn't build the temple. So the temple, when he says, "I want to dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple," he's not talking about the temple in Jerusalem, because it's not until Solomon comes along that the temple is actually built. So he's talking about being in the very presence of God. He's asking for the same thing that Moses is asking for. And then Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 13. It's this great hope that one day we will see and know, even as we're seen and known. John in 1 John chapter 3 says that what we will be, we do not yet know, but we know that we shall be like him because we shall see him as he is. And then, of course, Revelation 22, verses 4 and 5. At the very end of the storyline, when the saints are there in the presence of God in the new heavens and the new earth, the highest point of bliss and Sabbath rest for those saints, for us, is that we will have his name written on our heads and we will see his face. So
if we're talking about then this beatific vision, this vision of God, you know, the place where I want to go, and this is just maybe my own interest, but I'm interviewing you, so I can do that. So, and that is that I immediately go to the topic of theosis, right? To me, this brings to mind this relationship between what is to come. As you pointed out, all of these texts point towards something that is eschatological, something that is not yet to be achieved. Yeah. But there is also this sense in which we partake of something like this in the present day, and you talk about the idea of participation some in the book. So my question for you is, I think about this kind of divine participation in this life that is kind of has this kind of now not yet type of dynamic that we see present throughout Scripture and all sorts of things. How does the beatific vision relate to that?
Yeah, no, that's really crucial, because foundational to any well articulated or well understood doctrine of the beatific vision is God's own beatitude. That's the foundation of the doctrine, is God's own beatitude, God's infinite self-happiness. The promise of salvation, which encompasses, if you use salvation as that broad category that encompasses not just your justification, but also your sanctification and your glorification eventually. The promise of salvation is that we would become begraced participants in God's own beatitude, that what God is by nature, which is infinitely happy, infinitely blessed, creatures get to become by grace. And that is the story of salvation. You can sort of draw this thread just by looking at, for example, the theme of life in the Gospel of John. So John 5:26, this famous verse to help establish the doctrine of eternal generation. For as the Father has life in himself, he has granted for the Son to have life in himself. So that's divine aseity from the Father to the Son. And the great promise of the Christian life, the hope of the gospel, is that we would get to become sons in the Son, that we get to participate in God's own self-happiness by virtue of our union with Christ. And so you're right that has already been inaugurated. It's been initiated. It is true. It's present right now. We are sons of God. We have been adopted into the family of God by virtue of our union with Christ, and even in some way that experience of participation, of getting to become begraced participants in God's own happiness, has been initiated by a kind of vision now. It's just the vision of faith. So if you're looking at 2 Corinthians 3:12 through 4:6, this was a crucial passage for my dissertation. But there is a similar kind of Paul alludes to this episode in Exodus 33 and 34 when Moses is on Mount Horeb and he has a mediated experience of God's grace or of God's glory. God shows him his back of his glory, and it has this transformative experience where Moses' face glows, and when he comes down from the mountain, the people of Israel are so freaked out that they demand he cover his face with a veil. And that is reminding us, as we're reading through Exodus, it's reminding us of earlier on in the narrative when the people had a similar reaction when Yahweh had showed up and smoke and fire and freaked the people out. And they basically said, we don't want to hear from Yahweh directly anymore. Moses has to be our mediator. Well, now Moses comes down after having this experience where he sees the back of the glory of God, and he's transformed by that vision. Now Moses has become like Yahweh. He's beginning to look a little bit like Yahweh. And so the reaction that he elicits from Israel is similar to the reaction that Yahweh himself elicited from Israel. And so Paul picks up that whole episode and he describes it in this new covenant context in 2 Corinthians 3 and 4. And he says, we all with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed from one degree of glory to another. He says that in 2 Corinthians 3:18. And then he goes on to say in 2 Corinthians 4, verse 6, that this image that we are beholding and being transformed thereunto is the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Okay, so that is what we're looking forward to in the Beatific Vision. In the most consummate expression, we're looking forward to seeing the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ in a direct and immediate sort of way. And Paul says we see that right now, and we are transformed by it. So I think it's right for us to sort of understand the whole experience of the Christian life of transformation, of being this series of kinds of vision and transformation that comes as a result of that vision. Right now in this life, what we behold is the same object that we will behold in the eschaton in the Beatific Vision, but our mode of beholding is different. So right now, what we behold is the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ by faith. But what we will behold in the eschaton is still the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. And it is in experiencing that vision that we are transformed into the likeness of God. And yeah, in that sense, we're being incorporated into, we're becoming begraced participants within a divine self-happiness that didn't originate with us and is not diminished by us, by our sharing in it. What God is by nature, we get to become by grace.
And so we're talking about this idea then of participation, as you're talking about here. Why don't we discuss a little bit about kind of what that means, maybe philosophically? Like what do you mean by participation? Because this is also like a philosophical way of speaking, right? There's certain kind of commitments that you have to understand what exactly participation means.
Yeah. Well, the thing to emphasize is that when we're talking about participation, there's one of two ways that we can describe it. We can talk about metaphysical participation,
right?
Which I'll talk about that in just a second, but that's true of all created reality, period. But then there's there's a number of ways that you could describe this, but it's like redemptive participation, soteriological participation. Um, and that's what we experience by virtue of our union with Christ.
Right.
And and then in the Beatific Vision, the most consummate expression of that. But metaphysical participation, it's just a simple way. It's a way of naming the reality of created being in relation to the Creator's being. So God is uh, God is life in and of Himself, and we have life by reception, by participation.
Yeah.
So there's no sense in which, maybe you could put it this way: there's no sense in which created reality ever has the attribute of aseity, which the attribute of aseity, you could say it positively by saying God is the plenitude of life and light and love in and of himself. He's the fullness. He is the plenitude of life. But to say it negatively is to say that he is independent. And when you put those things together, God is independent of anything and anyone. He's not defined by anything or anyone else because he is the plenitude, the fullness of life. But that feature of God's independence is a subset of his aseity. Well, created reality is not independent in any way whatsoever. We are constantly ever receiving our life and being from him. So Paul, when he's on the Areopagus in Acts 17,
Yeah.
and he's quoting from the Stoic philosophers and poets, he says, "In him we live and move and have our being." I think he means that in a deep metaphysical sense. He will go on to say in his epistle to the Romans, "For all things are from him and through him and to him." And so, yeah, I think that he really is talking at a deep metaphysical level when we're talking about that sort of thing, that all of our being is received from God, and God is being. So this, there's maybe we don't need to go this deep into the weeds, but there's all sorts of distinctions between created being and God's being that draw on this concept of participation. So created being is finite, God's being is infinite. Created being is complex. So it is the composition of various parts, metaphysical parts. All created being is the composite of act and potency, whereas God is pure actuality. So we have our being from Him, but He is being in and of Himself. And the important thing to draw out there is that this participation, this link that we have to God, is asymmetrical. In other words, we live and move and have our being in God, but God does not live and move and have his being in us. All things are from and through and to him, but not all things are from and through and to us, like from him.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't work like that. It's there is a one directional relationship between created being and divine being. And that's foundational because Augustine in his Confessions, he opens up with this prayer, this famous prayer, "O God, thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee." And then he concludes, I love this, he concludes his Confessions with a allegorical interpretation of the 6 days of creation, which feels like whiplash. After he has this meditation, this deep philosophical meditation on the nature.
Yeah, everybody always thinks it's a really
it's
weird break. Like, what is he doing? Where is he going with this?
Yeah, but the thing that where you can actually draw these things together is he's making a thesis statement about not just his own life, but all of created being itself. Right. So it's not just Augustine that has been made restless, and his heart is restless until he finds his rest in Yahweh. It is all of creation is restless until it finds its rest in God. So that at creation, this is something I'm drawing out in my current eschatology dogmatics book. At creation, God created all of the created realm to have this telos of being brought into Sabbath rest, finding its rest in God. And when God creates man to be the his vice regent over all of creation, what he does there is he basically makes it so that if creation is not brought into that Sabbath rest under man, then it's not going to be brought into that Sabbath rest at all. And so it's all of creation that is moving toward God. When Paul says all things are from and through and to you, he means that. He's not just speaking hyperbolically. He means all things. All things find their telos in this Sabbath rest in God. And you have somebody like Maximus the Confessor, which I think you can take Maximus's insights and combine them with Augustine's and basically say that it's not just individuals who say, "Oh God, thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee." And it's not just creation that says, "Oh God, thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee." But you can also say that all people and all of creation says, "Oh God, thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee through Christ." So I don't know if that answers your question, but I've been just kind of rambling about participation and
this is great. No,
ideas.
This is a very, very helpful, I think, explanation. So we have that distinction between you're calling like that saving participation, which we're talking about believers, and this kind of more general metaphysical principle. Lutheran theologians generally use this distinction just between a general union and then a special union. Right? That there's this general sense in which all of creation participates in God, exactly in that Mars Hill sense, as Paul is quoting Aratus, the Greek philosopher, which is clearly distinct from that kind of union that's described elsewhere that we usually call the mystical union or union with Christ more generally. So we've got this kind of philosophical principle here. We've got the theological principle, not that the philosophical one isn't also theological, it is. But you're making a broader metaphysical claim, and then you're making more of a claim about what redemption is, what salvation is, what that looks like in terms of our own union with God through Christ. So let's talk a little bit then about how all of that is expressed and you've already cited a lot of scripture. There's plenty more scripture we can talk about. But I want to get a little bit into some of the theologians that you cite here, because you are pretty broad, as I said, in terms of theological traditions. You just cited Maximus Confessor, for example, who is one of the more influential figures for the development of Eastern Orthodox theology. And there's plenty of dealing with St. Thomas Aquinas, and then you deal with Reformed figures like Turretin, and then you deal with Johann Gearhart from the Lutheran tradition. So certainly want to hear you on Gearhart here, but let's just start talking about maybe a broader question. In your exploration of this doctrine, do you feel like you have found within these various traditions and theologians from various traditions, do you feel like you found areas of significant divergence on this particular doctrine?
I have found some, but not as much as some theologians might want for there to be. So I can maybe put it that way. I don't know. I'm at this point, it's too early for me to sort of name names, but I've been exploring and sort of discerning from some quarters a tendency to say, no, the Beatific Vision is not from some Reformed circles. No, the Beatific Vision is not the best framework is not to understand our union with God in terms of participation, but rather in terms of covenant, something like that. And I just confess I don't see that as a stark as being stark options. I think that a lot of the covenant, the communion by means of covenant that comes from the Reformed tradition, for example, I think is wonderful and sound, but doesn't undermine this idea of participation. In my estimation, it doesn't have to. I think, and another example is some theologians make a big deal out of the Christological emphasis that someone like John Owen will place, and they'll contrast that with Thomas Aquinas. And some people have even made they put forth the thesis that Owen is self-consciously correcting Aquinas for what he perceives to be a Christological deficiency in Aquinas. And as I dug into the research for this book and particularly that question, I'm just not really that convinced that that's what Owen is doing. I think he is bringing a great level of Christological emphasis that up until him is kind of hard to find in the tradition. So I do think that there is a really unique contribution that someone like Owen actually makes in terms of Christological emphasis in the Beatific Vision. But to pit it as a divergence from a Thomistic account, I think that is probably not what Owen had in mind. But yeah, so I do see differences. Honestly, I see more of a difference between Owen and Calvin than I do between Owen and Aquinas. So there are some differences, but they're not exactly where you think they might be. I would say that probably the biggest difference between Protestants and Roman Catholics when it comes to the Beatific Vision has less to do with the essential features of the Beatific Vision itself, and more to do with some of those adjacent theological topics where the Beatific Vision touches up on. So, like issues of soteriology, merit, justification, those sorts of questions, where the Beatific Vision or purgatory, where the Beatific Vision touches on those areas where Roman Catholics and Protestants disagree with one another, then it's not surprising to find that. Like, for example, the how do you give an account for differing degrees of blessedness in the Beatific Vision? Some people in heaven have a different degree, a greater degree of blessedness than others. Well, Aquinas answers that question in a way that you would expect. He says that difference is accounted for in terms of merit. That person's, that individual's merit, the merit that they have accrued in this life and then also in purgatory, that is going to determine where they are in terms of degrees of blessedness. And Turretin comes along and says, well, no, that can't be the case, because the only merit to speak of in terms of our right standing with God in terms of a judicial category is the merit of Christ imputed to us by faith. So it's not merit that accounts for the differing. So he has a different account for differing degrees of blessedness based on the Protestant distinctive that distinguishes him from the Roman Catholic tradition. So that would be one. And the other would be the difference between a post-Gregory Palamas Eastern Orthodox conception of the Beatific Vision versus more of a Western, I would say Augustinian, Thomistic, Anselmian vision of the Beatific Vision, which the difference is Eastern Orthodox. Well, there are differences in terms of the Eastern Orthodox distinction between the divine essence and divine energies. So that kind of comes into play, but that is not the biggest difference. I would say the biggest difference is with Palamas. He's coming from a hesychistic framework where his articulations of the Beatific Vision are coming in the context of him defending his hesychistic mysticism,
right?
Which is basically arguing for a kind of experience of eschatological Beatific Vision in this life. So it's the Taboric light, so Mount Tabor is traditionally the place in Israel where you can sort of that tradition has identified this is the place where Jesus took James, Peter, and John up on the mountain and was transfigured before them. So they talk about sort of striving to get toward this Taboric light, this Taboric vision, and they essentially say this is something to shoot for. This is something to you can't control it. It is God's grace that sort of gives you this experience, but you can do things to sort of conveniently position yourself to get to experience this Beatific Vision in this life when you experience this Taboric light of Christ. And I tend to identify myself with the Western tradition that would respond to that with St. Paul's reflections in 2 Corinthians about how fully granting that we can have a category for supernatural mystical experiences in this life, sure. But Paul outright says that to speak of the things that he saw and heard there would be unlawful. So it's not something, he doesn't paint this picture of this is what you need to be doing to try to position yourself to get to this kind of thing. His whole logic with the Corinthians is completely inverted on that particular question. He's saying, no, this isn't the goal. This isn't the goal to sort of have these out of body supernatural experiences in this life. In this life, what you can guarantee is a life of sanctification through suffering. That's what you can expect, in this life. So that would be the big difference. Eastern Orthodox post Palamas has a doctrine of the Beatific Vision that fundamentally posits the possibility of experiencing the eschatological experience of the Beatific Vision in this life, and they would see the difference of our experience of the Beatific Vision in this life versus our experience in the eschaton as more of a difference of degree than a difference of kind, whereas from more of a Western tradition, there is a clear distinction between any kind of experience of transformation that we can experience right now and the Beatific Vision that we're looking forward to in the eschaton, and that the distinction is marked by death and resurrection. You don't have the Beatific Vision in the final full eschatological sense until the resurrection. So that would be one difference that I would say is actually kind of significant when it comes to sort of defining the Beatific Vision.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty consistent with what I feel like I've found, looking at sources from these various traditions, is that I feel like there's a pretty unified conception in the Western Church of the Beatific Vision and really of theosis as it leads up to the Beatific Vision, depending on how you define theosis, which is pretty significantly distinct in the East. And I think for precisely the reasons that you've just mentioned there in terms of what that means for our experience. I am a little bit curious for you to unpack a little bit more about this, what you see in terms of divergence within the Reformed tradition or pushback maybe against the Thomistic conception. First of all, I'd say, what you've said about the difference between, say, the Protestant and maybe Thomistic conception of the Beatific Vision is not really on the Beatific Vision itself. It's really more about things related to it. Right. And I think that's exactly right. But I have seen a little bit of what you're talking about from the Reformed side of things, specifically more from, Van Tillians. Is that kind of you're talking about as those who, there's a school of thought within the Reformed world, and there's certain Reformed figures who have written, texts against Thomas Aquinas and do tend to emphasize this very kind of profound sense of discontinuity between the Thomistic tradition and then the Reformed tradition. And I know there are various forms of like interpretation of the Reformed tradition on those matters. I feel like
that's fair. Yeah.
I don't want to like put myself in the middle of a Reformed debate, because I'm like looking at the Lutheran sources. But I do think that there is this kind of focus on covenant can, I think, at times veer toward, and we've had this issue in Lutheranism, but just in different contexts, towards a forensic versus participatory motif, like kind of competition, right? As if you have to kind of pick one. And covenant is kind of more of this forensic category. Therefore, it's the forensic model, not the participatory model. So I'd like you to just maybe unpack that a little more in terms of where you see divergence in the Reformed tradition, and that could be today or could be in the past. Yeah. But you mentioned divergence between Owen and Calvin as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
However you want to unpack that.
Well, okay. So that one, I can do that one pretty quickly. That one in particular, Calvin pretty clearly in his eschatological portrait of Christ in terms of his mediation, makes the argument that in the eschaton, the Christ's mediatory role as the incarnate God-man will cease. And so the incarnation is not the incarnation and his mediatorial experience is a role in the Christian's life, is not an everlasting sort of thing into the eschaton. And Owen obviously doesn't agree with that. Right. So that would be the differences in terms of the who actually who actually has the more Christologically deficient vision of the Beatific Vision it's definitely Calvin, because Aquinas, his understanding of the Beatific Vision is that uh, we experience the Beatific Vision in Christ. So it is
Right.
his experience of the Beatific Vision that we come to participate in. So participation is huge for Aquinas when it comes to the Beatific Vision, which I think gives him a deep reservoir of Christological reflection for the Beatific Vision. He famously didn't finish his Summa, and one of the sections in his Summa that he didn't actually get to was going to be deeply Christological. And so it is almost one of those things where I think we can't really, the jury isn't in terms of how Christological would Aquinas's full account of the Beatific Vision have been if he
Right.
had actually sort of gone in that. But he gives us clues, he gives us inclinations in terms of earlier portions in the Summa where he's dealing with Christology, and he does make it very, very important that we are experiencing our experience of the Beatific Vision happens by virtue of participating in Christ and his experience of the Beatific Vision. So yeah, so Owen brings that. When you were asking the question though, in terms of the divergent traditions, I think for me it was easier for me to kind of stay uh in the you know the earlier expressions of the Reformed tradition. But
Yeah.
yeah, I do think there's clear there's well uh, Michael Allen wrote a book called Grounded in Heaven, where he's kind of talking about the Beatific Vision, and more generally, he's bringing forward, he's kind of putting forward asceticism as a important aspect of the Christian life that can be perverted, but we need to, we can't get rid of it. There is a serious sense in which we need to be denying ourselves in our pursuit of Christ, and but part of that is bringing up the Beatific Vision. And one of the things that he draws out is that, particularly in the Dutch Reformed world, which is people like Van Til would sort of say, yes, we are the Dutch Reformed,
Right.
and the Van Tilian sort of crowd is very distinctly saying, yeah, yes, we are part of this Dutch Reformed heritage. And Michael Allen identifies himself within the Dutch Reformed sort of heritage, but he says that there is a tendency in the Dutch Reformed world to lean toward what he calls an eschatological materialism, or an eschatological secularism. I think it's one of those terms: eschatological secularism or
Yeah.
eschatological materialism, something like that, wherein the pendulum swings from basically a sort of pop level, purely ethereal vision of heaven, of the afterlife, to know what we're looking forward to is new heavens and new earth, new creation, restoration of the cosmos, and that sort of thing, which is all good and true. I think, gloriously true for the eschaton, that we're looking forward to the restoration of the heavens and the earth. But he kind of draws out that within that is coming within that is coming from that reaction. One of the fruits is a maybe a overly carnal view of the afterlife, and so the burning hearth at the center of the home of heaven, of the Beatific Vision, has been lost. And so it's basically, in some visions of some of the ways that some Reformed thinkers in the last couple hundred years have talked about the eschaton, it almost just sounds like Earth 2.0. It
Sure.
sounds like more of what we experience here, but just better, which I think is true. It's an element there, but the need has always been to wrestle with these the relationship between bodily experience of delight in God and this intellectual vision of the Beatific Vision, and that need doesn't go away. We can't just say, oh, we're having to wrestle with those things, we can just kind of do away with that because the eschaton is the new heavens and the new earth. It's like, well, yeah, it's there, but that need of sort of wrestling with how you actually relate these two sets of biblical promises together is still actually there. So I do think that there is a tendency. I think one of the other sources of that kind of insistence on drawing a divergence from views of the Beatific Vision that I've been articulated and sort of saying like, no, this is a uniquely reformed way, is just coming out of that, like a maybe defensive, maybe kind of a fighter kind of mentality of sort of more of a polemic kind of mentality, which I can appreciate. You can appreciate this as a Lutheran. What is the the Lutheran relationship with the Reformed or with the Roman Catholic Church is that they're banging on the Roman Catholic Church's door and saying, "We haven't let us in. We're not done reforming you yet."
Yeah, sure.
So there, this kind of fighter mentality, I sort of get, but one of the ways that it materializes itself in the Dutch Reformed Van Tillian kind of world is to sort of insist upon having a unique version of any doctrine that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And so we can sort of say like,
true.
no, our version of it is the best version. And so I think when you have sort of covenant as the counterpart of participation, I think it's unhelpful because covenant doesn't have to be at odds with participation. Just like what you were talking about, the judicial versus the restorative aspect of salvation. These things go together. They don't have to be competing. And actually, the judicial creates the boundaries, creates the legal boundaries within which the restorative can sort of flourish.
Right.
And it makes sense. And so we've always kind of understood that the familial telos of justification of our legal standing before God is adoption. And so covenant, to me, in my mind, covenant should bring all the warm fuzzies. It shouldn't bring the connotation of no, we don't want to get into all of the warm and fuzzies. We don't want to read Gregory of Nyssa and his homilies on the Song of Songs and that kind of thing, like the soul's union with God, that sort of thing. But I want to say, why not? It exists within the boundaries of covenant. That is the context in which it makes the most sense. So yeah, I do think it's there. The kind of the tendency to sort of carve off your own our own sort of way and sort of saying, no, this is our version of the Beatific Vision and it's totally different than the Roman Catholic version or whatever. I think that's definitely there. I think it's probably exaggerated. There's probably some good points there when you get down into some of the particulars, but I think it's unfortunate. It doesn't actually need to be that. Even in terms of the relationship between the ocular vision of God and the intellectual vision of God, the Western tradition, the Western Catholic Church tradition, and the Protestant tradition can find actually a lot of agreement there. So Johann Gearhart is one such example. He kind of well, I don't know if you want us to get into there. Let me pause there and see if you had any other follow-up questions, but I don't want to keep on rambling.
No, that's good. The next thing I was going to ask you about was what you found in Gearhart. Now that we've talked about the Reformed tradition there, I was going to ask what we've talked about the Eastern tradition a little bit. You talked about Aquinas a little bit, but what did you find within the Lutheran tradition, particularly, Gearhart is the one you dealt with here.
Yeah, well, Gearhart, this book began a new and beautiful relationship with Gearhart that I anticipate will be ongoing for a long time.
Glad to hear.
Gearhart, I don't know if you saw Scott Swain on Twitter or on X. he posted about how he loves Gearhart, but he feels like Gearhart doesn't love him. So
that's how everybody feels about Lutherans.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's one of those. Yeah, you know that meme that Star Trek meme where the woman's like, "Oh, are you friends?" And the one guy is like, "Yes," and the other one's like, "No." That's us. That's the more reformed
Baptists we're the ones that
Presbyterians.
Say no.
We're like, "Yeah, we're friends," and then Gearhart is like, "No, we're definitely not friends." But no, I really, really appreciated Gearhart. He's a scholastic theologian in the best at its best, in the sense that he is so clear. And he is a treasure trove. He basically just takes the cumulative wisdom of the tradition, and he dispenses it in his own writing. So you're not just reading Gearhart. When you're reading Gearhart, you're not just reading Gearhart. You're reading the whole Western tradition when you're reading Gearhart.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things I really appreciated. But the primary thing that I drew out of Gearhart goes to that particular question, the relationship between intellectual vision and ocular vision, and sort of a subterranean problem here below the is the vision intellectual or is it ocular. Even below that is the problem of how can a finite creature know in any way the incomprehensible God, the infinite incomprehensible God. And the broad conceptual solution to that we find all the way back with someone like Gregory of Nyssa, who basically says he can't unless we qualify it by saying that knowledge of God is increasing forever. So you just say, finite creatures plus an infinite God plus the Beatific Vision equals an endless expansion of experience of delight and knowledge of God forever and ever and ever and ever. So that's not super new, but with someone like Augustine, for example, he begins to sort of venture into the speculative in the best sense of that word. And he basically says, like, okay, so you know how in this life we have knowledge that is mediate and knowledge that is immediate in some qualified sense. So like the immediate knowledge is like the blackness of this book is not something that I had to the knowledge of the blackness of the book is not something that I had to reach at the end of a logical syllogism. Right. It's not like that's the conclusion of a process of reasoning. It's I see it and I know it. It's immediate. It's right there on the surface. The redness of an apple. You're not reasoning to the redness of an apple. So that's immediate knowledge, and then mediate knowledge are things that you have to draw out by way of deduction. So induction or deduction, you're basically drawing conclusions from what you can actually draw out from the world or from logic or whatever. And so the heavens declare the glory of God, the sky above proclaims his handiwork, Psalm 19. That knowledge of God is there for everyone, but it is mediate. The glory of God shines through the heavens, and day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. It communicates knowledge to us, but the knowledge that we get from creation about God is mediate. We have to reason our way there. And so Augustine basically says, okay, we have those. What if in the new heavens and the new earth, what if the relationship between our souls and our bodies, and what if the new powers that we have in our glorified resurrected bodies means that the marriage between the soul and the body is so perfectly wed that all of our knowledge of God is just as immediate as the blackness of this book is immediate to me right now. Like right now, we know that God is omnipresent. But what if some of the new powers in our new glorified resurrected bodies is that we can know God's omnipresence in an immediate way where we see it. And so the relationship between ocular vision and intellectual vision is more properly wedded together. So that's kind of, Augustine begins to kind of scratch the surface at that. Well, Gearhart does it as well, and Gearhart does it in a really, really clear fashion. And he also explicitly connects the dots. This is the thing that I really appreciated for him. He connects the dots by basically saying the problem of us getting to see with our eyes what is essentially unseeable is no more of a problem than the fact that we right now say that we know what is unknowable. That the end of John's prologue is the only God, no one who has ever seen the only God, and then he who is in the Father's bosom, he has made him known. So he just says at the end of John's prologue that Jesus makes known the unknowable. Jesus in Colossians 1, Jesus is the image of the invisible. He makes visible the invisible. Any kind of revelation works like that, where in this extreme paradox where we are somehow mysteriously knowing the unknowable. We are apprehending the incomprehensible. And so he basically says, look, it may be a big leap for us now to kind of look at our own bodies and look at our own experience of intellectual sight and ocular sight, and to say that the two would be so wedded together that they're indistinguishable, that they are one and the same experience. It may be conceptually difficult for us to sort of accept that now, but that's because we're not in that state. But if we just kind of take a step back, that's no more of a conceptual impossibility than any of the knowledge that we have about God right now.
Right.
Because divine revelation works exactly in that way of basically making the incomprehensible comprehensible. So,
yeah, very helpful. So as we're kind of coming to an end to our time here, so we should probably end with maybe this question of practicality, because you're exploring this doctrine, theologically, historically, exegetically, but also practically. And so you have this whole section at the end of this book on what this means for the Christian life. So if you were to just kind of give a quick summary of someone who listens to all of this and says, why does this matter? What does this mean for my day-to-day life? How do you respond to that?
So, I mean, there's a lot that I want to say.
I know.
There's a lot of doctrines that there's a lot of doctrines that I kind of draw, or a lot of aspects of Christian piety that I explicitly connect the Beatific Vision to. Prayer is one. I mean, I'll just name some of the ones that I discuss in the book, and then maybe I'll sort of zoom in on a couple. Prayer is one. Corporate worship is another. Suffering, the sin and sanctification is another. And missions is another. The impact of the Beatific Vision on missions, and then friendship is another. So maybe I can kind of close with this, because this is my favorite of the reflect. I mean, all of them was my favorite, were my favorites, but this one is my favorite, that I think is unique, that Christians don't really think about very often. So there's two figures that really drew out this principle of friendship, the importance of friendship in the Beatific Vision. In the tradition that I benefited from. One was Anselm, and the other is Jonathan Edwards. And Anselm, towards the end of his proslogion, he is, he's kind of gotten mentally there to imagining the Beatific Vision, and he's talking about what enriches the Beatific Vision and all the delight that's there. And he explicitly names the presence of other saints and angels there as intensifying the joy that's there. And Jonathan Edwards, he draws out the biblical principle where he basically says in his sermon, "Heaven is a World of Love." He says that in heaven we will obey the second greatest commandment perfectly. So the two great commandments are love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as you love yourself. In this life, my love of neighbor is an aspiration. Right. I want to love my neighbor as much as I love myself, but none of us ever really do that. None of us ever really love our neighbor as much as we love ourselves. But he says, no, it's actually not an aspiration. It's a reality in this world of love. So when I think about, you can just sort of imagine the scenario. We talked about how the Beatific Vision means ever increasing capacity for delight in God. So the thirst for God increases everlastingly as the satiation for that thirst is satisfied ever increasingly forever and ever. So you're just your happiest moment is topped by the next happiest moment, on and on and on forever and ever. So just imagine this sort of thought experiment, that I'm there in heaven new heavens and the new earth. I'm experiencing the beatific vision. Every moment is happier than the one before. And then I glance over and I see Jordan. I see my friend Jordan, and it's, oh, there's Jordan. He's there too, and he's also experiencing the beatific vision in this way, his happiest moment. And in that world of love, I love Jordan. I'm not just aspiring to love Jordan as much as I love myself. I do love him as much as I love myself. So his mere presence there, your mere presence there, experiencing the beatific vision, literally doubles my experience of joy. And then I look over and I say, oh, it's my wife. There's Shannon. She's experiencing the beatific vision as well. Now it's tripled, and it's and on and on and on. Every single person that's there intensifies in that perfect multiplication your experience of the beatific vision forever and ever. And when Anselm is writing about this towards the end of his proslogion, he gets the kind of reaction that basically everybody gets whenever you start talking in this way, where you're like, I can't even comprehend that. It is that level of ecstasy is beyond my even imagining, but my inability to sort of go, like, I've hit the absolute limit of what I can imagine, and I'm delighted by that. Like what you get once you get to the precipice of what you can even imagine is just worship. I like to say worship rushes in where contemplation fears to tread. Like I can't comprehend that any further, but I can worship, in light of it. And so what does that do for the Christian life today? I think it puts all of our friendships in their proper eschatological context. So, for example, we talked about even some theologians that disagree with us, and I can name people in my life that we have parted ways, even over theological issues that we'll never sort of like come back to. But it is a great, great consolation for me to know that if they are truly, if they're truly saved, then they will be intensifying my experience of the beatific vision. And so that enables me to pray sincerely and earnestly for them. I think about, church discipline cases that I oversaw as a pastor that were deeply troubling and heartbreaking, of having to sort of get to that point where you excommunicate a church member because of unrepentant sin. And I don't know how the story ends for those people, but I know that for any one of them who is truly a believer, trusting in Christ by faith, before they die, they will be there too. And so again, it sort of helps to contextualize my posture towards them. But then also other ways of experiencing sort of loss and fragmentation in this life. We live in Abu Dhabi, which is literally the other side of the planet of all our people, all my people, my family, my friends, my old church members, my fellow pastors that I served with. All the dearest and close people in my life are living on the other side of the world. And so, we've had friendships just sort of end because of distance and changes of life. You have death in the family, that kind of thing. This is a very transient place. So we've experienced, even as our family, we've experienced people living here. Our lives get collided together. We get, mixed up with one another, and then our hearts get ripped apart as they leave, or we leave, someday. And that kind of, it's hard, homesickness and missing friends and that kind of thing. And there's a tremendous consolation to know that even this is one of those ironic things where even the present heartache of hard friendship in this fallen world raises my own affections for the beatific vision, and it helps me to have a particular kind of posture in the way that I approach friendship in this present life. Because if I'm thinking about the eschaton, then it will radically impact the way that I make friends, the way that I keep friends, and the way that I treat ex-friends, if you could put it that way. So
yeah. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. That's very practical. I think very, very helpful, and really brings this doctrine into real life, into the way that we think about one another. So To end here, then, not a question about your book, but just to say, where can people find you? If they want to maybe look at some of the other things that you've done, whether it's writing or, I don't know, other podcast interviews or anything like that, where can people find you?
Yeah, I don't have a single place where I've collated any podcast interviews, but I am the director of publishing at Credo Magazine, so I do a lot of writing for Credo, so you can find my writing there. Probably the best way to kind of get anything that I'm doing would be to follow me on Twitter or X. So my handle is Samuel_Parkison. Not Parkinson. Don't search for Parkinson. This is the story of my life. Autocorrect tries to tell me that my
Yeah, I'm
name
sure.
is spelled incorrectly all the time. But it's Parkison, Parkison. But yeah, other than that, if any of your viewers happen to find themselves in the United Arab Emirates and they want to hang out in Abu Dhabi, you can find me here. Otherwise, you're probably just going to find me on the internet. So,
All right. Well, thanks so much.